All right, if anybody has questions to kick off the discussion, please come to the microphone.
I'll start. I'll ask the obvious question. In regulatory framework of reasonable expectation for no harm, how do you deal with performance standards given that regulatory standard?
Wow, no one wants to touch that one.
Well, I will, because I sat with the risk assessors at OPHS, and here's where I'm at on meat and poultry, but I also think it applies to the others. Right now, we are so far from zero relative to the number of salmonellosis outbreaks or illnesses that we have. The question is, how can we get a reasonable kind of approach so that it incentivizes the industry to continue to move down so that we can answer that question when we get closer to zero, in the mix. And that's been kind of my argument relative to the approach that FSIS has taken in theirs, and I think FDA has done it in several places, that their risk assessment is done on the last immunocompromised person, right, that gets ill from our products. But the gap between where that is and where we're at today, we are disincentivizing many times the industry, right, from trying to figure out how to close that gap. I'd love to have that conversation when we are close, right, in there, but we're quite a ways away. I mean, we have salmonellosis is the #1 illness, public health illness that we've got relative to bacterial food contamination. And so the question is, how do you progress towards it, right, in a reasonable fashion that allows it, and then we can get to zero. I'll contrast that to E. coli 0157, H7 in ground beef. All right, when 10 cells can kill a 4-year-old, right, in a product, you then have a public health risk, in that. And moving towards a zero, we were in that zero conversation, in the mix. I don't place salmonella in the place. So we've not kind of said, hey, where are we at? Where can we go? How do we get there? So that we can then have that conversation about zero harm. They haven't even moved the bar on their 2010 goals on reduction of salmonellosis by, 25%? We haven't met those as an industry, as a government in the U.S. So how can we talk about conversation on getting there and then be able to get to your question? Because we're a long ways from that.
I'll just add a piece to that. So we, as consultants, did some work on salmonella in pet food and transfer to humans, so because animals are not susceptible, or typically. So the risk really, when that hits, of course, is the human transfer. And I think this question is really interesting because we believed, being risk assessors, that there is potential, and I guess when I was listening to your question, Steve, I was kind of thinking about a case-by-case. You can't, there's no blanket approach for the industry. But ideally, I think you could take something like that, where you have hand-to-mouth transfer, and think about a risk assessment approach, because I do believe you can get to a reasonable certainty of no harm. We know that salmonella has been in there. I think every speaker up here said it. In that particular example, in pet food for forever. I think many of you commented that in your own products, it's in the chain somewhere. And so this chasing zero is ridiculous. But I think maybe an approach to getting at what you're asking is to take a case-by-case approach, and pet food might be a nice one because you have a little bit more control. You could actually design some studies to get at risk assessment.
This is Haiping Li from Dairy Farmers of America. So my comments is the situation should really separate ready-to-eat food from the food should be a continued process, have a care step. So from that point of view, because for most ready-to-eat food, the manufacturer operate under mentality they need to get away from liability. So zero tolerance, yes, it's not functional, but it's a way for them to really be able distribute their product. So my another comments is about I'm a microbiologist. So what's the language really to estimate performance standard? Do we use generic indicator as a way, or is there any thought there? Who is a microbiologist?
Well, I'll take this. I mean, we convened an expert panel, of which Dr. Hedberg is part of that, and I think there's some other part of that as well. And the performance standard, I think that we are looking at exploring is looking for LM, is looking for Listeria monocytogenes. But because some of the generic or what you would call the indicators really aren't necessarily, I don't think, indicators. To your previous comment about ready to eat, and it should be confined to ready to eat, it does tend to be. However, when you've got agencies now redefining what ready to eat is based on consumer misuse of a product, it's troubling. And there's products that actually don't have a lethality step. So I think it should be about changing that conversation a little bit, and just love what Angela was saying in regards to it doesn't give those incentives when you have zero and you start not looking for it, and that's not where we should be as an industry. And to put a label of ready to eat or not ready to eat, Listeria hasn't changed either. I mean, we've had that, what CDC uses, I'm not sure what the grimace emoji is, but it's like the straight line emoji, so no smile, no frown, but it hasn't changed. So, I mean, I think from our standpoint, it's not helping us, and it's only, as I mentioned, I've got members that they won't even consider Zone 1 testing. And I've got members who live and breathe in Europe with their 100, and they finish product test it, they do environmental, and they're seeing decreases in their, because they look for it. They're looking for it, they're actively seeking out that, doing the root cause and destroying it. And we see that it's not encouraging that type of behavior here in the US, at least.
Yeah.
Well, I was also just going to jump in. I mean, you pointed to the ready to eat, not ready to eat piece of it. And I think, we hear about risk assessment, and I think the session before this one today, kind of talked about some of these things, is that I'm pretty sure that most ready to eat products, 100% of those are going to be consumed in the format that they are sold without cooking. I mean, some are cooked, but we know that product is very close to 100% of it will be eaten without cooking. So as you look at a risk assessment, as opposed to a not ready to eat product, and whether we're talking about something like flour or ground beef or chicken or certain frozen foods, we know that a very small percentage of it is eaten without cooking, tiny. And so in a risk assessment, that should matter. And I think this is where we talk about performance standards, maybe on the not ready to eat side, is saying, and I go back to the example I used before, is that, I didn't really talk too much about the Salmonella recall we did, but we did a recall because one state agency tested a package of flour and found a single Salmonella positive in that. Now, from a risk standpoint, knowing that Salmonella is there at some rate anyway, it feels uncomfortable to say we're taking action on a product that 99.9% of the time that's likely to be cooked anyway, and we don't know what the level of Salmonella was. And so that's part of this discussion is how do we get to the point to say, had we known, or had a company known they had made a mistake and did something severely wrong and there was a lot more Salmonella there than normal, that's a different situation. But that's how performance standards could tell, is it a normal background situation or is it something else?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you said. So I think there is such a a big gap here. Is the regulatory agency really need to react on this? For example, we all know environmental has Salmonella Listeria, and they encouraging us to find it, right? So the point is, when you constantly have listeria in your environment. I remember one of the 483 form they issued last year was cite them not work hard enough to eliminate Salmonella or listeria. Don't remember exactly. The point is, finding is good thing because we are finding, but can we speak the language truly encouraging finding? Rather than if you keep having the record, then you are in trouble. You are not effectively control your product. So my background is I worked in FDA before, so I really understand there's such a huge gap in between our practice and our theory, and as well as what we should do. So yeah. Thank you.
I'm Don Zink with IEH Laboratories. I think about this quite a bit, and I'm certainly an advocate of the idea of performance standards. I think there's two huge hurdles to moving forward. First is how safe is safe enough? And that's going to be pretty product and process specific. I would like to see that debate take place in terms of lifetime risk of infection for a population. And I would say that if you get somewhere in the vicinity of 1% or 5% lifetime risk of infection, that's probably in a category of safe enough. Maybe something more liberal than that is safe enough. But I think that that's the term of reference, how you ought to approach this. Certainly strategically, you've got a better chance of having a productive debate with a product and process where really you have some level of control and consistency. I think flour, for example, is a much better example than leafy greens, although leafy greens, I think, could be in there. If I had to start somewhere with a debate on this, I would rather start with flour, because you do have some level of pathogen reduction in the flour manufacturing process. Like it or not, some people treat it as a ready-to-eat food. You have to deal with that. But I think it would be possible to do a kind of a quantitative risk assessment with that and have that kind of thing. But here's one of the problems with quantitative risk assessment. You can do that assessment, but can you get somebody to make policy based on that assessment? I would say our friends in the EU are a bit more inclined to do that than we are here in the US. I could point to numerous risk assessments that were done, but policy did not necessarily flow immediately from those risk assessments. So it has to be a risk assessment that everybody is really, really confident in. Just my thoughts.
Well, and I'd like to pick up on a couple of the things you just said there, because I think the debate over how safe is safe enough is the foundation that all the risk assessments translate into policy. And we have this vision in America that things can be absolutely safe, and that's sort of where the regulations are following. And so part of what we need to do, I think, is have that discussion over how much safety do we really need the system to be able to provide, and having some realistic bounds around what is achievable is I think part of the discussion that needs to happen and happen on a very broad basis. Because I think we really don't have clear public health objectives that we're trying to accomplish, and then that limits our ability to really map what's happening in industry to what's happening in the public health sphere.
Hi, I'm Rob Scharf. I'm at Ohio State, and I have a slightly different take on things because I'm an economist. So my interest, of course, goes directly to the incentives that you talked about from this. And I do definitely agree that implementing performance standards does create an incentive to do more testing. My question is really how much more would be done, because there remain other incentives that really you can't get past to not do testing. And I'm speaking in particular of the desire to avoid litigation and the desire to avoid reputation effects due to, if there is ultimately an outbreak, for example, and the company is implicated and it's found that there was a positive test, for example, so maybe at a very, very low level, but there's going to be a segment of the population that looks at that and says it was a positive test. And so they're going to be punitive towards the company. So I guess my question is, how do you think all this is going to shake out?
I wish my legal counsel was in. Go ahead.
Having lived some recalls, in the past, and particularly around Salmonella, right? You get into some E. coli 157, I'm going to set those aside. The pathogens are important as to which pathogens you have. Salmonella, though, you can make an argument, and my last slides that I put up, right, is, okay, one, it's not an adulterant today, all right, other than some of the things they're doing on what they declare as ready to eat, kind of non-ready to eat pieces, but if you've got a raw product, there also is a big body of data that says there's dose response, right, that Salmonella, right, probability of illness works upwards, right, and there's a curve, a shift in the curve that says as you move up enumeration, the amount of Salmonella you have, right, you can increase the probability of illness, right? Our company is measuring at 1 CFU per gram, right? I am not measuring at 0 in my ground turkey or in my ground beef, right? But the data supports in Salmonella, right, for the folks not even testing, right, out there, that I am taking the worst, highest probability out. So I have taken a positive intent, a positive program, and you know what? It doesn't. The piece of it is that won't matter in litigation, right? You're going to pay, if you go to litigation, and the whole part, you're going to pay for the illnesses regardless if I tested or not in the mix. But Salmonella has some room, right? Several of these organisms have some room because of dose response, low levels, right? If you can show that you've done some work, you have an idea of what you have in your system, and you've taken active control measures against those, you can work through the litigation. I think there's a lot of companies that take, your approach and say, I'm not even going to touch it, right? But if you do some homework, you can work with it with knowing what your baseline is, take some of the science, and you can work forward with it.
So you think there would be a significant amount of retesting?
I think, some of these on some different organizations, we've come to a little better ground on, say, Listeria in the meat industry, right? Because, and it was a fight, Dave Menard, you can share with me, quite a fight in the late 90s, relative to allowing us to test define and not beating us up over it, okay? In the meat and poultry industry, I do zone 1s, right? Because USDA at that time, and again, it was a battle, said we'd rather you go seek and find it, right, on that, and it's just not an automatic assumption that the product is positive, right? So I can find zone 1s without having to take action on my product. Now, I can't test product, right, in there. So there's some rules, and you cannot have a continuous zone 1 positive, right? There's some boundaries, but it allowed the industry to go in and actually seek and find and destroy, under some reasonable peace without ever, having to throw the product away, or the fear of having to throw the product away, every time that you found a zone 1. That policy, unfortunately, right, that's been before 2000, right, we're 20 years into it, FDA has not slid over there to allow seek and destroy, especially in some zone 1s. I do believe that there would be some movement in the zone 1 space in LM, right, on there. I know we did in the meat and poultry space when we were allowed to do that from the mix. Salmonella is going to be an interesting one, in terms of what you need to do. I do think if they would give us some credit for reduction, right, instead of this qualitative approach, that we could see some movement in incentives and being able to say, hey, today there's no incentive to do it, right? I just pass performance standards. I don't have to worry about high-level product going out. So, each company's going to approach it differently. From there, do their own internal risk assessments, and economist is right, on there, right? You'll make your own, but there are some ways to make it improve.
Yeah, and I was going to weigh in as well, and there's no way I can give legal advice or should give any kind of legal advice, but worked with the lawyers enough to say if performance standards exist and companies are doing some testing and trying to improve, and I think that's what the purpose here is, to say then we can see what's going on and find ways to improve. That at least gives some balance to the the litigation that might occur in other cases, but that overall view that, number one, we're just going to, theoretically, we're going to drive risk down because there will be improvement. And again, not trying to speculate on the legal side, but from legal, or from juries and other things, if you're being a leader and trying to improve, you're likely to get, be in a better position than just doing nothing.
I was just going to chime in with I'm glad you brought up economics, because I feel like in a way there's an elephant in the room on this topic, that it's very hard to talk about. A recall can cost a company hundreds of millions of dollars, if not upwards of $1 billion, when you take into account the time of everybody around the table and the lawyers and et cetera. But we're also talking about, depending on the severity of the recall, you're talking about lives. So it's in severity of illness, and kind of going back to your term, Steve, reasonable certainty of no harm. And I think this is what limits us a little bit in actually pursuing true risk assessment on this topic, because it's easily misconstrued as greed of the company. And so it makes it difficult, I think, to get the right people around the table to try to do the right thing. And no one wants anybody to get sick. We also don't want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on recalls. An outbreak is 2, by definition, 2 which is mind-boggling to someone, because that word is so alarming. So I think actually what you raised is really interesting, and I think it's a big part of the problem of why it's hard to move the needle on this, because when money gets involved and lives you're talking about the spectrum, it makes it a very difficult situation. I wish we could get past that and try to do some good science to drive this to the right level.
Hi, I think this is a great conversation. I just had one question from more of like the retail perspective. So what challenges do you have to think through from a quantitative perspective when you could have further bacterial growth further down the supply chain than where you're doing the testing?
I've heard that before. And it's in a perishable product, right? Refrigeration, along the lines. There's no question that is an element that should be considered as part of the risk assessment, but one of the elements, not the element. I don't know how many times I've heard the conversation of, hey, we can't even consider enumeration because it'll grow through the supply chain, when we don't know today what that risk truly is. I do have, I can't deny that there is probably a consumer here last weekend. I don't know how many of you were in Louisville last week, but it was miserable, okay? Walk out of the grocery store, put their ground beef package in their trunk, right, or in their back seat, and stop, 4 places before they get home, right, in the mix. And then their refrigerator temperature probably not sufficient, right? I don't know if we know the true risk of that. That's where the zero conversation becomes really easy, right? I have to make sure that never happens to anyone, so we're going to do 0 and 1s when we do the risk assessment. But it's only one of the elements. That is true today without, with the amount of salmonella that we already have, right, in the mix. And so it is one of the elements, if you do a true risk assessment, that you have to weigh in. You have to weigh in the consumer behavior of cross-contamination in the kitchen, right? I think actually, from my standpoint, it's probably a lower risk than some of the things that we see in preparation. on the mix, and it just needs to be weighted appropriately, right, when you do a total risk assessment.
So, I mentioned the school lunch program, and one of the elements of safety built into the school lunch program is how ground beef is handled at the point that it's being prepared and served in the schools. And so there are rules around how that is handled as well that provide additional control over any salmonella in that ground beef actually getting to one of the ultimate consumers. But the retail setting where probably we see the most risk for amplification is restaurants. And we have sort of the food code exists to try to manage contaminants coming in and limit the potential for amplification within restaurants. And there is some evidence that how well engaged managers are in that practice will modify the likelihood that salmonella transmission occurs. And that is regardless of whether salmonella is coming in with a food worker, with raw meat or poultry, or with produce as a potential source of introduction as well. And so I think we need to, really, again, look at how these systems are put together and function rather than focusing too narrowly on any one part of the system.
Hi, Alan Gutierrez, University of Florida. I like this idea of moving to the performance standard. As a graduate student, as a microbiologist, I like having more quantitative data. I like generating more data points, and the idea that will incentivize you guys to improve and to fix any issues that you find by actually finding them, by looking for them. My only issue, and we've talked about this a bit, about consumer behavior, essentially, is that as part of that risk formula or equation, it's exposure and it's hazard. And that exposure, if we're going to possibly, because we're not doing zero tolerance, pass on more hazard to the consumer, then we're really going to have to push hard on consumer behavior and consumer education. And the question is industry ready to really support that, if not doing it themselves, but we saw the opening talk the other day talking about consumer behavior and educating consumers, and fund those people to really educate Americans, and so that when we introduce more risk or more hazard, this doesn't happen.
I'll take that. So as I mentioned, our focus is on Listeria mycetogeny. So this is going to sound odd, but we have the luxury of having targeted consumer education. I think that tends to be what is so overwhelming to those that represent industry, is that when you're talking about a consumer campaign that truly can educate and measure behavior, that is an expensive endeavor. So we're actually looking at that way, because in many cases for us, you're looking at misuse of products. So we did some consumer research that looked at why is it that consumers are misusing the product? Is it just not knowledge of what they're doing and there's behaviors? And we found that that's the case. And then looking at what would resonate with them, be it in our case, a cook for safety label that is disruptive and can show, this is a not ready to eat food. But you have to have, even with consumer education, you have to have the other components with it to continue. You have to have the implementation of the best practices. You have to be looking for those and doing the root cause and trying to lower that, even with consumer education. Because while you want to target, in our case, a vulnerable population, you're not going to hit everything. But I think all those combined are necessary. But again, a consumer targeted campaign for Listeria is a little more doable, and that's why we're going to be kind of moving down that path and tackling that. But it's difficult to change behavior. We understand that, but I think what we're living with right now, this zero hazard, type of approach, is not getting us moving the needle, as Angela mentioned either. Is we can't we've got to get away from that paradigm to, I think, truly see some type of impact.
People who know me know that I'm pretty direct, okay? I'm going to challenge your statement that we're looking to increase the hazard. I do not believe the conversation here is about allowing a greater hazard. It's the approach at which enforcement comes in and companies can approach looking at the hazard and come to a reasonable approach so we can actually decrease it. If you get into, right, okay, so say in the flower space that they are actually allowed to do, or LM, allowed to do zone 1, you'll find more information about it and you'll actually improve the output and reduce the hazard. If Salmonella moved to quantification, right, performance standard, right, maybe allow a low level to work through the system and not get beat up for it, but we take out the 3% that's high, I have improved and removed the product that has the highest probability of illness. So this isn't about allowing more hazard, it's about dissecting the products, it's about dissecting the various organisms and allowing a system that actually reduces the public health risk with it, right? And not saying that we got, that's the problem with the hazard versus the risk, looking at the risk of it. All right, so if you're only going to say hazard and hazard equates to public health risk, then we've not done our job, because that was the shift, right, that we're wanting to do, is to think about, okay, can I make a change in performance standard, right, that actually impacts the public health risk, even if my hazard adjusts a little bit. So hopefully you take that in the right vein. I mean, it's not about increasing the amount of product we're getting into the marketplace that potentially creates a risk. It's how we make that approach differently. So hopefully that makes sense?
Yeah,
okay,
of course.
All right.
I mean, I may have misspoken, but I did not mean to say that this would necessarily mean that you are always passing off more hazards to the consumer. I meant may pass on more hazards, but yeah.
Now, as a ground beef producer, I mean, we do 8 billion servings a year, all right? I just assume they're going to screw it up. Okay? I do extra things on frozen ground beef patties. We, over the last 15 years, have found that people will not stand at a barbecue on, I cringe after every holiday, right? For 4 weeks after Memorial Day, 4th of July, and Labor Day, to figure out who didn't fully cook their ground beef patty while they're standing there with kids yelling at them, on a barbecue, right? So we're not going to get to the people serving 8 billion times on consumer behaviors. We do need to continue. I mean, there's conversations, because there's just folks that have no clue about preparation anymore. We're not teaching in high schools, et cetera, et cetera. But as a producer of product, I have to assume they don't know how to do it. And so we're trying to take those approaches and work with that public health risk. With this, we need to continue the education where we can, on there. But, we have a lot of our consumers that never look at the label. I put something on the label, they'll just never look at it. So our intent here is, well, I've got a perishable product that has no lethality step, right? I have to do the best I can with the risk, knowing that there's a small fraction of it that will not be handled properly. That's how we have to approach it.
Thank you.
Hi guys, Roger Cook, New Zealand Food Safety. Absolutely brilliant discussions, agree with everything you've said. I don't really want to get into the word adulterant, but thinking about what Don said about how safe is safe, that's a policy decision that's set by the politicians, and it's not just safety, human health. I think some safety of job retention comes into that as well. But I won't talk about what is reasonably likely to occur or not, because unless you've got some metric around that, it's another emotional type description. And what I will say is there's some good work that's just come out of Codex on chemical risk assessment about MRLs, that when you detect a chemical that you're not expecting at very low levels, previously countries have actually stopped trade if that's detected. Now Codex has worked extremely quickly through a process of defining how you do a risk assessment to determine if that sort of chemical is going to be a food safety risk or not, and trade can continue until let's say a food safety limit is identified rather than just an MRL failure. So there's some good work going on in Codex around that. I do have a question, and maybe it's Angie and Craig again, around Campylobacter. Now, I understand that this week FSIS are going to release the new Campylobacter performance standard. I understand, now previously it's been based on enumeration, or at least on plate counts. I understand it's going to be based on enumeration. I don't know what that's going to be, whether it's going to be like our STEC, like the Salmonella performance standard. How would you, if you had to set up a standard based on prevalence, which could be 0, it could be just adulterant, plus minus, or it could have a moving window scenario around it, but how would you set up let's say a performance standard based on presence absence such that it reflects what you want it to reflect? I might be able to answer.
I don't want to monopolize this. Okay, so a couple of different things. One, FSIS in the meat and poultry space has it based on qualitative presence absence, right? It is not working in the Salmonella space. Now, the Campylobacter that you saw, they are looking at a quantification. I think that moves us forward. It's very similar to New Zealand's approach. It's very similar to, was it Denmark or Belgium? I forget which other country, one of the European countries, right? It's actually workable for us in industry too, right? I can take action on a level, right, in there. Now, how they want to go about the enforcement piece, right, in that is where we get challenged, on they don't really do enough samples, and there's a lot about sample size and how many samples do you have to determine whether you've got some process control in place. That's where we get into the debate, right, and how many. So USDA has moved to this 52, sample a week, right, that they're working on. I actually think there's probably a little bit of, some good statistics in behind that, and it makes more sense on a quantitative than it does on a qualitative approach. So we're a proponent of moving into the quantitative piece. Easier on Campylobacter because the methodology is much friendlier towards quantification in Campylobacter. I think that's been a major hurdle for Salmonella relative to, I don't know how many of you do MPNs, but they're ugly, in the mix. And so I do believe the technology is moving forward, right, in Salmonella to be able to get us to some quantification. So I think we can make some progress in the quantification, and then even the rolling window, that they put in is manageable, right? You're able to work with it. And for the data that we worked on, we worked with Dr. Hedberg and some of the stuff he's doing, actually make a public health impact greater on that next step than what we've done over the last 20 years in the meat and poultry space. So I think it's happening. I do think there's an improvement in the quantification standards that are coming, and a recognition that low is, you want to get rid of it, but it's okay while we're trying to get the high out of the system.
So just, and totally agree. So I just got to add to it what's happening in New Zealand. So we've had an enumeration standard for Campy. When we put it in place back in 2007, 2008, we had a distribution curve that we knew from broiler carcasses, a rinse, the same as we would do for the mega rig, and we got industry to accept that we needed to move the distribution curve to the left by 1 log. So that, according to the Danish risk assessments, would tell us we should be able to knock about 25% of human cases, and we have 120,000 human cases a year in Campy capital of the world, if you like, and we should be able to shift it. So, but the issue for us was, if we shifted 1 log down, we couldn't, and we took the mean 1 log, we were below the limit of detection of an enumeration method, and we still are. So we set it based on the 80th percentiles of the distribution curve, and for companies we put a performance standard, moving window standards around detection above certain counts. And that worked extremely well. We basically knocked the counts by 70%. We got the log plus more out of the poultry industry. We watched the CAMPI human cases drop by 50%, so it worked beautifully. But now we're trying to drive it down that next bit. And we're having to put in place, guess what? We're having to put in a presence-absence. So, because we can't actually measure the enumeration. We can a little bit, so it's a joint at the moment. There'll be still counts above, but the rest of it has to be by presence-absence, because that's still measuring the shape of the curve around that level of detection of the test. And I think that's where the trick comes in. We can use zero tolerance, if you want to use a bad word for it, but enumeration, as long as you understand what that means in terms of a frequency distribution of the counts. And you don't get too hung up on about it, because you still need to know what that high end is, so that so that you are allowing, if you like, the 1 and 2 organism per carcass accidental detections, if you like, but you're still working on getting rid of that top end. So it's how it's sold is going to be the important part, and certainly, as you say, how we as regulators and how FSIS as regulators respond to it. So I think we're getting there. We're all getting to the same point. The adulteration around the STEC, that set us back a long way, but I think we're getting there.
Hi, Laura Jeltowski from CDC. I have a question about frozen foods. Do you have any thoughts on consumer education or differences in the performance standards for frozen foods that are meant to be eaten frozen, like the frozen fruit mixes that you would use to make a smoothie or something like that?
Yeah, that is, we expect that, those are ready-to-eat items, so they would need to be held to that same standard. But I still equally have those same folks saying, in the current zero, it's very difficult for them to operate. They don't go through a heat step at all, so they're in kind of the same situation that fresh is. I think this is going to sound odd, but to their advantage, they have background microflora that Listeria really can't compete with. So they have other concerns. But we're still going to focus on developing best practices for them, because we see that we still need to make sure that we're not contributing to the issue. I've had this kind of discussion, I think Don just left, but with Don Zink, is that, don't make it worse in your situation. Don't contribute to recontaminating. So that's kind of our education is focused on the best practices, because, again, they don't have a mitigation step whatsoever, and even with the consumers.
Right.
So, the education that we're recommending in regards to the label, they wouldn't be able to bear it on their labels, because it's going to be for not ready-to-eat items.
Okay, thank you.
I think the Listeria issue is really interesting, because in the United States we are at historically low levels of Listeria incidence. And there's a lot of things that have been happening on the food side in increasing testing and detection of Listeria that raises some questions as to what that impact is actually on human exposure and illness.
Yu Qian Lo from PepsiCo. Question for Scott, right? So I feel, the flour is a perfect example, because in that case you have 2 pathogens detected, right? One is cause illness, another one is not, right? I like the concept of performance standard, but it probably is difficult to get a regulatory accept this right away. But if we can go this gradually, I think one example there is, would it be possible to using the framework, the performance standard, to assess the flour as a special example, to propose, accept or not, scientifically, what's the performance standard would be look like? So in that case, the scientific community can see that as example, maybe gradually influence the regulatory to accept this concept.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think if the question is, could we propose something or should we propose something? I think the industry more broadly, and I can really only speak for my company, while as much as we think that there is a possibility to go that direction, I still think there are, some significant gaps in data that we need to figure out how to collect. And I think it really gets to some of the other discussions around levels that are there. So there's pretty good data on the prevalence of Salmonella in flour, and I think, studies have been done over the years, and you can typically find somewhere in the 0.1 to 1% of samples are going to test positive, and again, it depends on the sample size and other things. What we really don't have good data on is what is the level of Salmonella in those situations. And so is that is it 1 cell per gram? Is it 100 per gram? And then what would actually cause illness? And so I think part of today is we're talking about the concept. I don't know that we're quite at the point to be able to be ready to propose something, but I think from a regulatory framework, it becomes very hard to collect data, because then the cost is borne by the companies to say, if we're going to test finished flour, for example, anytime something tests positive, that product cannot be put in the marketplace. And I think what causes maybe even a bigger challenge for the flour industry is that anybody who knows milling operations, the idea of clean breaks and when did it start and when did it end is really, really complicated, because ultimately flour mills may never get a cleaning that a dairy plant would see or a meat facility might see. And so there are some complicated questions, but I think, we want to move down that, down that road to say, what would it look like? But we probably have to collect some more data in the meantime.
Yeah, and the importance of data, I think, is so important. But, I mean, we needed to do our own quantitative risk assessment. So our industry funded looking at numbers and prevalence of LM. In many cases, we had to rely on industry contribution of their data. Unfortunately, a lot of that is positive, negative, just based on their environment, but that we live in and regulatory. But just to get that program started, it delayed the project over a year because of liability issues that we face here in the U.S. So we had to come up with a blinding protocol where it was our legal counsel entering into agreement with a company just to share their data, and it's protected so that, and the researchers that got the product, they never know who they're receiving product from, when they do testing, and, so it is blinding, and so when the results are out there, there'd be no attribution back to companies but there's a risk assessment that was done years ago when NFPA years ago did it. I think, Dane, you were there at the time. So much easier to do it in that environment. I don't know why, but it was. So we had to get data and information and contribution. It's so difficult to do quantitative risk assessments now to get that data and prevalence. It's just the regulatory and legal environment is really tough to get that information.
You can lead a consumer to safe handling instructions. You can't make them read it. And I feel like, if I use my hairdryer in the bathtub and electrocute myself, I'm not going to be able to go after that company. So with these not ready to eat products, I kind of think like all these recalls are telling the consumer the exact opposite of what we're trying, all this talk about educating the consumer. But when we recall raw meat for having salmonella on it, it gives the consumer the impression that it's not supposed to be there, and all the rest of the meat at the grocery store doesn't have salmonella, otherwise it would have been recalled. So I don't know, I don't have any solution for this problem. I just wanted to point.
So you're saying the government is misinforming the consumers?
No, absolutely not. I said nothing of the fact. But I do feel like sometimes in an effort to protect people, we are actually giving them a very false sense of security.
I get this. I'm sure all of us, when we're sitting down to the dinner table with our family, oh gosh, and a just recent case for our industry is the berry sampling assignment. So what do I need to do with my berries? They've got viruses all over them. I'm like, no, they don't. But yes, I think that's what does tend to lead when we see these situations of recalls, because in our industry, most of those with not ready-to-eat items, vary aside, but not ready-to-eat item recalls, they're class 2, but that has no meaning to a consumer. So really only in the circle of this room do we understand the differences of, the risk associated with that. So I think, and people don't look at recalls as being a good thing, particularly if it's initiated by a company. So they found it, and they get lumped in the same area where, someone else found it, like the regulatory agency found it. There's no acknowledgement that they're doing the right thing in initiating a recall. Yeah, don't get me started on the whole recall thing. It's just
I was just going to add, thank you for sharing that comment, because I think it is a very important one, and I think the communication platform that's part of this big umbrella of topics that we're talking about is so important. Just an anecdote, I taught a food safety course, to middle schoolers. They don't know who Typhoid Mary is. They don't get this education anymore. Right. So, and we live in this litigious society. So I actually loved your comment because, I'm sure any of you with your own children or nieces or nephews or whatever just want them to have their own responsibility. You have part of the responsibility to do the right thing. So I do think that is an important part of the risk communication platform. I know IFIC, just to give them a plug, they did partner, I believe, with USDA to roll out some training videos, and they were a big success. But, I think it takes money and effort to continue to do that.
And I was just going to say, I think you point to something that maybe we need more topic of conversation, is this broader concept of like the higher order risk assessment. So if we find a pathogen in a food product and somebody says, well, it's a hazard, therefore you have to remove it. But if you look at the broad risks, to what you say is that if we do recalls and we have communication for things that aren't really important, that changes the overall risk profile. And so there's a higher order thing here that is very complicated and hard for people to come to grips with. But if we think about the trade-offs of these things, and that's where I think part of this is performance standards, we all want to make the food system safer. If we did more work, we might see more things, and that feels risky in some ways, and government agencies may not be willing to take that risk, but the broader thing is long term, it's actually going to reduce risk, and that's hard to measure.
Well, and I think the modern food safety atmosphere in this country springs back from the outbreak at the Jack in the Box restaurants, and President Clinton articulating that American families shouldn't have to worry about getting sick from eating a hamburger. And that got translated into zero tolerance for E. coli 157, and everything else has really sprung from that. And the zero tolerance for E. coli 157 gets held up as a great success story. And it's true that we do have a zero tolerance for E. coli 157 in ground beef, and we do have sort of historically low levels of E. coli 157 infections, but there's a lot more involved in getting to that low level than the zero tolerance policy.
I know we're running short of time, so I'll make it quick. Two shining examples. You just came up with one that will help the cause if you use that information kind of as an anchor. 0157 was declared an adulterant, but it took 8 years before the needle began to move in terms of the contamination rates. Why did it take so long? It wasn't until the regulatory policies allowed testing without going out of business that flipped the switch, turned on the radar, and allowed industry to make the corrections, because now you've got data in real time that shows you what happened, when it happened. You can go back, check your process, say, aha. Lock in those interventions. There's a lot of research that went on in those 8 years that facilitated that. But Angie, you've heard me request the opportunity to use the G6 data. It's there. You can show exactly when the contamination rate started going down, was when the testing rate went up. Oh, yeah. And you've got the information, and so I encourage you to use it. The Listeria example that you came up with earlier, we wandered in the wilderness for 15 years after Listeria was declared as zero tolerance. And before, at least on the USDA side, we convinced the agency that if you allow a certain number of positives in a testing program, we can drive the rate of listeriosis down in this country. And you can pinpoint it right there. That's when the change really started happening. So use those examples, they're there. And they're there despite the government making those zero tolerances. And, you know, it's just a matter of not necessarily what the policy is, but how you implement it and what you do from there. So thank you. You've got the tools. God bless you.
All right, thank you. That's time. Thank you to the panelists for a wonderful roundtable discussion, as well as our audience members for keeping the discussion going. Thank you very much.